For college students, summer is a time to relax, unwind, enjoy the nice weather, the good times with friends and family, kick back, and not have to think about schoolwork or exams for at least a couple months. It's also a time many students get a summer job, and that's what one 19-year-old from Kansas City did in the summer of 2002. She took a job as a pool attendant. She expected to bask in the sun and socialize. She never expected it would lead to her murder. This is her story. Deadly Deep Dives. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Kimbyrleigha, and if you've never been here before, it's nice to finally meet you. Before we get started, please give me a moment to thank our sponsor for today, and that is PDS Debt. I think most of us know how easy it is to get into debt. I know with the holidays coming up, that's always a time where I can easily max out my credit cards. It's happened time and time again. But what's not easy is getting out of debt. That's because the system is set up so that we don't. If you're struggling with credit cards, personal loans, collections, or medical bills, you need to check out PDS Debt. I know right now I have those looming medical bills from having my newborn daughter, but I also know that PDS Debt provides a service to match you with debt solutions tailored to your personal financial situation. If you're making payments every month on your debt and your balances aren't going down, PDS Debt has solutions for you. Everyone with $10,000 or more in eligible debt qualifies, and there's no minimum credit score required. Bad and fair credit is accepted. You can save more while paying off your debt in a fraction of the time. PDS Debt strives to understand your specific scenario and can help provide alternative solutions to becoming debt-free. You can stop waiting and start saving, and so many of you have already taken PDS Debt's free debt analysis. If you haven't, it's easy. It only takes 30 seconds. Just head over to pdsdebt.com/Kimber. That's pdsdebt.com/Kimber to get your free debt assessment today. And thanks again to PDS Debt for sponsoring today's video and making this case possible. In the last 50 years, 340,000 murders have gone unsolved in the United States alone. Everyone knows the more days, weeks, months, even years that go by without finding a killer, the less chance there is that a perpetrator will ever be found. Once an investigation is reclassified from an active case to a cold case, the chance sinks even lower to less than 50%, with some estimates saying it's less than 30%. This week, you're going to hear a story of a very gruesome murder, a terrible loss for a family that never expected something like this, a twist of fate that no one saw coming. But you'll also hear a story about a community, an investigative team, and especially a father who would not rest until justice was served. He would not allow this murder to become a cold case. He worked tirelessly to catch a killer and bring him to justice. This is the story of an evil deed, but it's also the story of a father's ferocious love. This is Allie Kemp's story. And I want to also tell you a word of warning. This story is not for the faint of heart. Tears interrupted my research and my writing several times as I prepared this story for you. I spend a lot of time online reading about bad people, but the hardest part about this case for me was learning about all the heartbreakingly good people whose lives were forever changed by this crime. It's the unwavering goodness in the face of evil that moved me to tears. And no one exemplified goodness like Allie Kemp herself. Allie was born on October 11th in 1982 in Leawood, Kansas, to Kathy and Roger Kemp. They named her Alexandra Elizabeth, and Alexandra is a name which means compassionate one, helper of mankind. Allie's dad said the day that Allie was born was the happiest day, and he felt the luckiest day of his life. He called her Princess. Allie was definitely a daddy's girl. Roger and Kathy raised Allie in Leawood alongside her two younger brothers, Tyler and Drew. Leawood is a bedroom community. It's an affluent part of Kansas City in the suburbs where people left their garage doors unlocked and open, kids would roam freely, and they didn't think about crime. It was a safe place for Roger and Kathy to raise their three children, and the entire Kemp family was very happy there. Allie was also very close to her grandparents, who she affectionately referred to as Grammy and Gramps. When Allie was born, they decided their granddaughter deserved a special gift. They searched high and low for the perfect present that would reflect their love for her. Finally, they found a beautiful Precious Moments Bible. If you've never heard of Precious Moments, they're known for their collectible, cute little dolls and figurines that were popular in the 80s and 90s. The Precious Moments Bible was not just any Bible, but a special book filled with pictures of the characters, especially catered to children. As Allie grew up, she cherished this gift. It became a prized possession. It was a keepsake she would hold on to for many years. Another thing I wanted to mention about Allie that I thought was interesting was that her favorite childhood snack was something that I don't think I've ever tried by itself before. It's kind of half of a smoothie, just mashed strawberries in a blender. That's it. From the moment Allie could speak, she exhibited a thirst for knowledge. Whether Allie was asking why the sky was blue or why birds could fly, her endless curiosity excited her father. Whenever Allie asked why, Roger became excited to answer all of her questions. He loved engaging with Allie and teaching her about life and the world around her. Allie flourished in Leawood, and as she grew up, she began to be known around the community for her kindness, her involvement, and her bright, megawatt smile. In middle school, Allie was voted the nicest girl in the 8th grade. In high school, at Blue Valley North, Allie was elected to the Sweetheart Court in her junior year and appeared in the yearbook a whopping 13 times. She was a student ambassador. She served on the student council. She played varsity soccer. She was a member of the National Honor Society, where she was elected Sergeant of Arms and co-president of Future Business Leaders of America her senior year. Allie's dad said that she loved high school and participated in everything. He said that she was into 19 different things in school. And Allie's mom, Kathy, said that Allie had it all in one package. She wasn't perfect by any means, but she knew where she was going. But no matter how busy Allie got, she never lost her kindness and the time she would spend with those she cared about most. She had a lot of close friends. And they described Allie in ways I have to share. Her friend Ashley said, while being involved with so many things, one would think you would get too wrapped up and forget what's really important in life. But that was never the case with Allie. She always had time to say hello or at least give you a smile. Stacia knew Allie as one of the few people who at any given moment would drop anything if you needed a friend. Jennifer, who was one of Allie's closest friends, said she was always very collected and had her head on straight. And you knew if you told her absolutely anything, you could trust her with it. Allie would brighten everyone's day. Her friend Kristen looked forward to the fun that she had around Allie, who she described as even peppy in the mornings, and there was never a dull moment with her. Even her guy friends took note of how happy she was. Lewis said that Allie brought happiness everywhere she went, and you couldn't even remember her ever being in a bad mood. She lived her life with no regrets. Allie was known to be really popular, really smart, but she remained grounded and sweet. I think the best way this could be described was when her friend Isaac said, "Think of a blinding light shining brilliantly in the sky. Now put that same brilliance in a person. That's Allie." And I know it sounds cliche, but in Allie's case, she was really the type of person who would light up a room. Allie graduated from Blue Valley North in May of 2001, bringing her light and happiness to the nearby Kansas State University. Allie showed the same drive and kindness in college that she did in high school. She joined the Pi Beta Kappa sorority, where she met some of her closest friends. She quickly became an involved member of her sorority and was elected as a chapter's Pan-Hellenic representative. Allie's pledge mother, Erin O'Brien, knew Allie as a bright woman who took on leadership roles in the sorority right away and seemed to get along with everyone. She said that nobody would have hated her. Nobody. But Allie wasn't just involved in her sorority. She was also dedicated to her schoolwork. In her freshman year, she finished in the top 10% of her class and was invited to join the honors program at Kansas State, as well as the National Society of Collegiate Scholars. She was also an academic scholar in the School of Human Ecology and a leadership scholar. And she played intramural soccer and basketball. Even though Allie wasn't in Leawood anymore, she didn't forget the relationships that she had there. She called her mom almost every day. And Kathy said that was just who she was. She wanted her family to be involved in her life, to be a big part of it. And one time, Allie was home from college and asked her mom to join her for lunch with some of her friends. And as Kathy watched Allie cross the street, dressed casually but cute and sporting a ponytail, she couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for being the mother of such a beautiful young woman. Allie's beauty attracted many admirers, but her heart belonged to one person, and that was Phil Howes, her high school boyfriend, who was attending a different college at the time. They were pretty serious. They even talked about a future together, but they were both still just freshmen in college, and they both wanted to experience college before settling down. Allie met Phil during gym class their first year at Blue Valley North High School. Their connection was instant, and they quickly became inseparable. Their love only grew stronger over the years. One Valentine's Day, Phil pulled out all the stops and arranged a special dinner for Allie. Despite his very poor cooking skills, Phil put his heart and soul into the meal, even getting his entire family to go out of the house so he could have a moment alone with Allie. And as the night unfolded, Phil's spaghetti dinner turned out to be less than perfect. The noodles were overcooked, the sauce was bland, the garlic bread was soggy. But despite the culinary mishaps, Allie was determined to make Phil feel loved and appreciated. She ate every bite, even insisting that the meal was perfect because she thought Phil was, at least for her. And if that love remained strong, then maybe they would end up together in the future. They believed they had all the time in the world to spend the rest of their lives together. If only they would have known how little time they really had left. Allie and her friends traveled to Florida for spring break in May of 2002, and they spent their nights sitting around together sharing stories and reflecting on their lives. It was a time for laughter and bonding, as well as reminiscing about their adventures and their accomplishments in the last few months of their lives in the first year of college. And during one of the heartfelt conversations, Allie made a comment that stuck with her friends. She told them that if she had to live her life over again, she would live it exactly the same way, that she had no regrets. Her statement struck a chord with her friends who couldn't help but admire how confident Allie was, how she lived in the present, embracing each moment like it could be her last. And Allie's words would become a chilling reminder of the fragility of life and the unpredictable nature of fate. Later that summer in 2002, Allie returned home from college for her break. She was staying with her family in their home in Leawood. She, her brother, and her boyfriend Phil all got jobs at the local Foxborough pool on 123rd Street and State Line Road. This pool is exclusively for Foxborough and Hunter Ridge residents. It's a popular family-friendly spot to hang out in the summer if you're in the Leawood area. Allie was excited to spend her first summer home from college with her family, her friends, and her boyfriend. She was really looking forward to her new job, lifeguarding and being a pool attendant. It offered several advantages. There were a lot of perks to this job, including being close to home, the opportunity to work outside, enjoy the weather, work on her tan, and she could also interact with her coworkers, her neighbors, and her friends. Allie was also responsible for setting everyone's schedule, and that was a plus. Roger Kemp, Allie's father, was also excited to have Allie back at home. Jennifer Wyand, Allie's good friend, said that Allie was her dad's princess, and princess in the most beautiful way because she was kind and so sweet, and she adored her parents. Roger had worked hard for many years to build the beautiful life he shared with his family in Kansas. Roger was born in Missouri in 1945, and after high school, he worked for several years as a painter at Ford Motor Company, painting the undercarriages of cars 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. He worked all day in the pit with cars rolling on top of him, but he was determined to build a better life for himself. Roger enrolled at Central Missouri State University, and after graduation, he moved to the Kansas City area and started a company called Quality Plastic Systems with a friend, which they operated together for 40 years. On January 27, 1979, Roger married Kathy, and together they had their 3 children. Allie in 1982, then Tyler in December of 1984, and 2 years later in 1986, another son, Andrew, who went by Drew. Roger worked hard, and because of that, he was able to afford a very nice lifestyle for his family. Their home was at 12,000 Mission Road in Leawood, and to me, it is a mansion. It had 7 bedrooms, 10 bathrooms, white pillars, tall archways in the front of the house, a brick exterior, a garden in the front, beautiful marble floors throughout. I'm putting pictures on the screen if you're watching. It's just under 11,000 square feet. The ceilings are expansive. The windows in the living room are from the floor to the roof. And there's a balcony overlooking that living room from inside the house on the second floor. Everything about it is grand. There's an outdoor fireplace on an upstairs outdoor balcony. It's like a castle. There's a full bar, an entertainment area with a foosball table and a pinball machine. On Zillow, it's described as a remarkable home. And it truly is. And the Kemps were very lucky but grateful to live there. Roger loved taking care of his family and being a dad, and was especially active in his kids' athletic pursuits. He coached and managed baseball, basketball, and soccer teams. Roger's friend said if there was a picture in the dictionary next to the word perseverance, it would be a picture of Roger Kemp. When something didn't go as planned, Kathy always said, "Don't they know they're dealing with Roger Kemp?" And unfortunately, Roger's determination would soon be tested in a way that he never expected. A dad like Allie's should be protected at all costs, and you will know why. Let's jump to the summer when Allie was home from college. It was June 18th, 2002, which began like any other day. Phil, Allie's boyfriend, was working the morning shift. He opened the Foxborough pool, and Allie was set to come in later in the day, relieving Phil and taking over the pool by herself around 2 p.m. She was set to work until 5, when she would hand over her shift to her brother, Tyler. That day, it was unseasonably a little chilly outside and breezy and overcast, so there wasn't anyone else at the pool. When Allie arrived, Phil informed her that because of the chilly weather, no one had actually been at the pool all day long during his shift. After Phil left Allie around 2:15 to start her shift, he went to his second job. And then, around 2:50, Allie called her best friend who lived nearby, and she asked her to stop by the pool and hang out to keep her company. A minute later, Allie called Phil to check in about their date plan for that night, but Phil didn't pick up the phone, so she left him a voicemail. Allie's friend arrived at the pool around 3:15. She pulled through the parking lot and right up to the gate where the pool is. Since she knew that no one else would be at the pool except for Allie, she figured she would be easy to spot, but she didn't see her anywhere in sight. Being a teenager that didn't feel like making the effort to get out of her car and go looking for a friend, she just kept honking the horn, acting really silly and loud to get Allie's attention so she could come and chat. But she was surprised that Allie never emerged from inside the gate. Instead, a man peeked out from the pool house, dressed in coveralls and carrying a bucket. He waved at Allie's friend, and then she panicked because she thought this man was Allie's boss. She was worried she might have just gotten Allie in trouble for making all that noise outside and coming to her work while she was on duty, so she quickly drove away. Then, a little before 5 p.m., Allie's brother arrived at the pool. He was taking over the last little bit of Allie's shift so she could go home in time to get ready for her date with Phil. He saw Allie's car, a black Jeep Cherokee, parked in the spot near the front gate, but when Allie's brother Tyler arrived and was inside the pool area, his sister was nowhere to be found. Allie's bag and phone, her car keys, and all her personal belongings were out on a table poolside, and although Tyler searched all around the pool, he couldn't find any trace of her. At first, he didn't think much of it. He assumed maybe she ran across the street to a local store and gotten something to eat. But then he looked at the pool maintenance schedule board, where each attendant has to mark off the tasks they complete on their shift, and he noticed that none of Allie's tasks were checked off. That struck him as odd, since he knew his sister to be very responsible. It really didn't make sense that since 2 p.m., Allie wouldn't have gotten anything done. She was supposed to test the water at 2 and 4 p.m., skim the pool at 2:30 and 4:30, tidy up the restrooms at 3:30, and straighten up the lawn chairs and the poolside loungers by 5, and none of it was completed. Now this was a cause for concern. He quickly called his mom, Kathy, and let her know that he didn't see Allie at the pool, and he asked if she was already at home. But she wasn't. It was in that moment, around 5:20 p.m., that Roger walked through his front door at home to find his wife on the phone with Tyler, at which point Kathy informed Roger that they didn't know where Allie was. Roger didn't waste a second. He jumped back in his car, he raced over to the pool, which is only about 1.5 miles away from their home. He arrived around 5:25 p.m., and Tyler was standing at the gate waiting. Once inside the pool area, Roger saw Allie's cell phone, her water bottle, her bag and books, and all of her belongings were neatly placed on the table outside, just like Tyler had described. However, there were no signs of Allie anywhere. Roger glanced around the entire pool area. He even looked in the deep end of the pool because he wondered if somehow she'd had an accident, fallen in the water, and become unconscious at the bottom, but she wasn't there. He even checked the baby pool that was only a couple feet deep. But again, nothing. He looked everywhere around the pool grounds, searching all the bathrooms and the pool house, but Allie wasn't inside. Finally, he walked into the pump room. The room was dark and cluttered. It was hard to see. Roger didn't think this is where his daughter would be, but he went inside just to be sure. He looked all around and to the back behind the pumps, and he was about to leave. But then he noticed a blue tarp lying on the floor. Leaning in closer, he saw what looked like a leg sticking out from underneath the tarp. I cannot imagine what flashed through Roger's mind in that moment, what reorientation of his world took place in those short seconds. Up until that point, he'd probably been hoping that there was an innocent reason for Allie's absence, that he would find her in the parking lot with a friend, in the bathroom getting ready for her date, or grabbing equipment in the pump room. But when he ripped the tarp up, all of those hopes vanished. All possibilities of an easy explanation disappeared because he found Allie. But this wasn't the way anyone would want to find their loved one. She was lying face down on the ground. Her hair was matted with blood. There was blood all over her. He could see she was black and blue all over her body. He could immediately see that she had been beaten very badly. He gently rolled her over, and when he did, he could not believe how brutal it was. He grabbed a hold of her hand and noticed it was cold. And despite the horror and sadness that I'm sure he felt in this moment, Roger jumped into action. He called 911 immediately. And the recording of this call is heartbreaking. I am going to play a portion of it for you, but first let me tell you what he said in case for any reason it's not clear. Roger told the 911 operator, "I think my daughter has been murdered." And the operator asked him why he thought that. And he said, "She's not moving. She's laying in the pool house. She's got blood all over her. And she has been RAPED. I can't say the word, but I will play that portion for you now.
With 911, what is your emergency?
I think my daughter's been murdered.
Okay, why do you think that, sir?
Because she's not moving and she's laying in the pool house.
How old is she?
She's 19.
Okay, stay on the phone.
And she's got blood all over. She's been raped
Okay.
to death.
Stay on the phone. Do not hang up. I'm going to go ahead and get fire and ambulance on the phone also, okay?
I need them here now. Oh, Allie. Oh, Allie. Oh, honey. Hi. Allie, stay with us. Stay with us. Are you there? Allie, come back. Allie, come to us. Allie.
Does it appear that she's breathing?
I can't tell.
I don't know about you, but when I heard that for the first time, it brought me to tears. The operator repeatedly asked Roger to stay on the phone with her and promised that help was on the way. Throughout the call, you can hear Roger begging his daughter to stay alive, to come back, to keep fighting. He said, "Oh, Allie, oh, honey, are you there?" And I can just picture Roger holding his daughter, pleading for a life that was probably already gone. He wanted to speak to his daughter. He wanted her to tell him who did this to her. He needed to know if there was any consciousness still left inside her. He was holding out hope that she would somehow come to. But she wasn't moving, and Roger told the operator he couldn't tell whether she was breathing. Roger explained what it was like to find his daughter, and that was truly heartbreaking.
When I found her and I rolled her over, I couldn't believe how brutal it was.
Police and paramedics arrived within minutes. Homicide detectives Joe Langer, Sergeant Scott Henson, and Chief Deputy Craig Hill of the Leawood Police Department were also sent out. And when they first saw Allie, they were shocked by the apparent violence with which she had been attacked. Chief Deputy Craig Hill said that I have to say that in my 35 years of experience, it was probably the most horrific thing. And just like Roger, the paramedics said they couldn't believe how brutal her injuries were. There was a pool of blood under the back of her head. Her face was swollen, and Allie's shirt and bra had been pulled up around her neck, exposing her chest area. Her shorts and her underwear were missing. There was also a ligature mark around her neck. Several of her fingers were broken, and a few of her fingernails had been snapped off. Police said it was clear from Allie's injuries that she put up quite a fight. She had severe blunt force trauma to her head and her face. EMTs couldn't find a pulse, but rigor mortis had not set in, so they attempted life-saving measures. A heart machine was also brought in an attempt to resuscitate Allie, but they could not find the necessary heart rhythm to use it. So Allie was rushed to the hospital, where she was joined by her family and her boyfriend, Phil. Unfortunately, a couple hours after she was admitted, a doctor and a nurse came out to speak with Allie's loved ones, and the doctor informed them that he had done everything he could, but he couldn't save Allie's life. She was gone. She didn't make it. Losing your daughter at only 19 years old is impossible to fathom, but losing her in this way, seeing her body covered in bruises and injuries that would force you to imagine her terrifying last moments of her life, I don't know how anyone could bear that. But Roger knew he had to stay strong for his little girl. He actually decided to spend the entire night at the morgue with her. He said there was no way that he was going to leave her alone. And in all the cases that I've ever covered, I've never heard of anyone doing this, and it truly shows how much this father adored his daughter. I know that I would never want to leave my child either, and it's bringing me to tears now. I'm sorry if I do get emotional sometimes, but I don't think you're human if this doesn't move you. He wanted one last moment with his daughter who had been taken too soon. And I know it makes some people uncomfortable that I get emotional, but if you have seen what I saw, and I'm not showing you everything in these videos, it flashes into my mind when I'm doing these videos, and it's, yeah. Seeing this father's face, knowing the brutality that he had to witness, a lot of times we might forget that we're talking about real people who had to see these things that have happened to people that they love so much. But I am going to pull it together for you and come back in just a moment. Back at the scene, the investigators began with a painstaking cataloging of evidence that they could find. Chief Hill said the best way he could describe this pump room is that it looked like a grenade had gone off in the building. You had a jigsaw of evidence in there, and it was going to take every tool you had to go in there and detail it, recover it, and rebuild it. There was stuff everywhere. You could tell how badly Allie was fighting to survive by how much stuff was out of place and thrown all over. There was pool equipment, pool noodles, trash bags, hoses, pumps, barrels of cleaning chemicals, ladders, tarps, and pool rafts, just lots of stuff to sift through. But they focused on the area where Allie had been lying and then moved outward. Crime scene technicians collected Allie's flip-flops, which were in two different parts of the pump room. They took swabs of the blood spatter and the blood pooling. But there was something that stood out. A first aid kit that was normally kept on one of the shelves had been dumped onto the floor. And one of the items inside was a tube of antibiotic ointment, and it was lying right beside where Allie was found, and its cap was off. And upon closer inspection, it appeared that there was blood on the tube and on the end of the cap. It was almost as though someone opened it to use it, or maybe they just stepped on it in the struggle and the top flew off. They couldn't be sure, but either way, it was swabbed and collected for analysis. Police also collected swabs from Allie's remaining clothing. Meanwhile, almost immediately after Allie's death, the news of her murder began to spread like wildfire through this small community. Local media was all over the story, and soon every news station was running it, which meant it didn't take long for residents of Leawood to hear the news. They were shocked. They were blindsided. One community member described it as a horrible, horrible nightmare. Of course, Allie's family didn't understand who could have done something like this. What started as a beautiful summer day turned into a nightmare that they could not wake up from. It was terrifying to think that this happened in broad daylight at the local pool in a safe neighborhood. The pure brazenness of this crime really left the locals feeling very afraid. Nothing like this had ever happened there. Friends and neighbors began to gather at the entrance of the Foxborough pool to pay their respects, leaving flowers and mementos. And one friend said that everyone knew Allie. She was so popular. No one could believe that this happened to her. They also couldn't believe it because she was so cautious. She wouldn't let friends walk to their cars by themselves. She was very aware of her surroundings. She was intelligent when it came to her own safety, and it seemed so unreal that this could have happened. The very next day, Allie's friends and family held a vigil for her, and Roger said that they received so much support, tremendous support from the Kansas City community, churches, prayer circles, synagogues. It felt like everyone had adopted Allie as their own. Allie's friends and family also created a website called Allie Forever, in which people could share memories and art in honor of Allie. Friends even wrote poems remembering her and grieving their loss. Roger said that in the wake of Allie's killing, everything reminded him of his daughter. When he had touched a bouquet of flowers for a moment, he thought of his daughter's hair. He said that when the family ate mashed strawberries, all he could think about was how much he loved his daughter and how much she loved mashed strawberries. Remember how Allie was always curious, asking why this, Dad, why that? Roger was now thinking that she was asking about her death and saying, why, Dad? And that was what everyone wanted to know. Why? And why Allie? On Saturday, June 22nd, 4 days after Allie's murder, her family held her funeral service at the United Methodist Church of the Resurrection in Leawood. Over 1,400 people attended the funeral, many of them wearing lavender and white ribbons in her memory. Allie was buried with her Precious Moments Bible that was given to her by her Grammy and Gramps. I wanted to include this part because I am always about signs and things that are really unique and different, and maybe they mean something. When they placed that Bible with Allie's body, it fell open to a picture with a caption. And the caption said, "No tears inside the gates." It was from Revelations 21:4. I don't know if it means anything to you, but you can take it as you will, and I'm sure her family did as well. That's why they mentioned it. At the service, Allie's parents said, "As we said in your high school yearbook, having you in our lives has been an absolute thrill. You didn't get the chance to become everything you could be, and that is a huge loss. We always said, you are a precious angel from heaven, and now you have gone home. You filled a space in us we didn't know we were missing until we had you. But now we are left with a hole in our hearts. We love you so much, our brown-eyed girl. We'll never forget you. One short year ago, we cried over letting you go to college. Now, as we finally have to let you go, may angels lead you into paradise. We thank God for you and your life." Reverend Alan Hamilton also spoke, and he described Allie as cheerful, naturally smart, radiant, amazing, and unusually loving. He talked about how people flocked to her and reminisced on her trademark snort when she laughed, her teasing of her little brothers, and how she would shout with joy when she was excited. He recounted how, as a child, she had written her grandmother little notes expressing her love for her, and then she continued the tradition in college, writing her classmates at Kansas State encouraging notes. He ended by saying, "There was a terrible, evil thing that has happened. It's left a huge hole in our lives, but evil does not and cannot and should not be the final word. There is goodness in you. Allie showed you that. She lived for you, and that's the word that has to prevail." After the service, Allie was buried in Mount Moriah Cemetery. Allie's tombstone was engraved with a poem that she wrote herself called True Friends. The poem reads, quote, "A true friend listens to what you say. Life's a sculpture, friends are clay. Friends are notes to life's great song, a melody that carries you along. Whether it's joy or fear, whenever life is hard, they're near. In a world of darkness, friends are light. So thank your lucky stars tonight. When life gets hard and goals seem far, it's then you'll know who your true friends are," end quote. How true that really is. So many in Leawood and beyond found a true friend in Allie. But as much as this community mourned Allie's loss, they were clamoring for police to identify her killer. Everyone was desperate for law enforcement to bring this perpetrator to justice. For Allie's sake, and before he could strike again. Law enforcement were also anxious to locate the killer as quickly as possible, and Leawood police contacted the Kansas City Metro Squad, who sent some of their elite team to join the Leawood force. All in, there were about 20 detectives working overtime on this case. Next, the investigators were analyzing the results of Allie's autopsy. Dr. Michael Handler, a forensic neuropathologist, performed this autopsy. He's board certified in atomic pathology, neuropathology, and forensic pathology, and he concluded that Allie had suffered both ligature and manual strangulation. But this is the worst part. Allie was not strangled quickly. Because of the petechial hemorrhaging, which is when the capillaries under the skin break and leak blood, creating these tiny red, brown, and purple spots, Dr. Handler believed it had likely taken the killer somewhere between 10 and 16 minutes to strangle Allie to death. And then there were periods of time when he paused and started again. I can't even imagine the fear and the pain that Allie experienced in the time that it took her killer to take her life. And this is after a horrific fight that left her bloody and bruised. Both of Allie's eyes were black and blue, her lip was cut, and I couldn't even count how many wounds she sustained on her head and her face from the report I read and the depiction I observed. Her arms were bruised and scraped. She had bruising on her back. Her hands, especially her fingers and knuckles, were all cut, and the fingers of her left hand were contorted and broken. She also had bruises on her face, both of her hip bones, her knees, feet, and her upper thighs. Let that sink in for just a moment. I know we go over these autopsy reports, but just imagine for a moment how someone had to get all of those wounds. There was also 2 lacerations on the back of Allie's head, which could have been caused by her fall or someone beating her over the head or her head against the floor. These injuries alone speak to the horrific, gruesome fight. The fact that the killer attacked her so horrifically and then drew out those last painful minutes is absolutely sickening. One thing that could not be confirmed, though, was whether she had been forced in intercourse, although it seemed from how she was found unclothed from the neck down that it was definitely the motive. The time of death was narrowed down to between 2:51 p.m. after Allie made that last call to Phil and 5 p.m. when her brother Tyler arrived at the pool. After the autopsy and detailing of the crime scene, police turned their attention to those closest to Allie. It is hard to think about, but in murders as brutal as this one, the victim almost always knows their killer. The brutality says this wasn't random. This was personal. Police collected DNA samples from Allie's brothers, her father, her boyfriend Phil. All of them willingly provided the samples. Roger had told the police that Phil was a sweet guy. He was a good kid who loved Allie, and that there was no way he was involved. Phil also had a decent alibi. After leaving Foxborough Pool, he had gone to work at another pool and then gone to a friend's house and played video games until he got the call that Allie was rushed to the hospital. His whereabouts were confirmed by those who were seen with him, but they still needed to be sure. By now, the swabs collected from the ointment tube and Allie's shirt and bra proved to be blood, but it wasn't just Allie's. It was a mixture of hers and a male's DNA. Considering she put up such a fight, they concluded this must be the killer's blood. When they ran the DNA, it allowed them to build a partial male DNA profile. Unfortunately, the sample was not clean enough or complete enough to upload to CODIS, the national DNA database. But police believed the sample they had could still be enough to match it with the killer's DNA. They just had to track someone down, get their sample, and then compare it. So they were gonna need some suspects. But Roger turned out to be right. It wasn't Phil. When the DNA samples were tested, none of the DNA they collected thus far matched the killer's profile. Phil, he was grief-stricken. He was angry, but he told the police everything he knew. He said to his knowledge, Allie had no enemies. He didn't know anyone that would want to hurt her, let alone kill her. All he knew was that sometimes Allie got a little creeped out when she was at the pool by herself. The detectives asked him why, and Phil explained that Allie had mentioned to him that there were some men that had been watching her. They were lawn and garden workers who maintained the pool grounds and the surrounding condominiums. She told Phil that sometimes they stared at her and they made her uncomfortable. Even the day she was killed, Allie didn't want Phil to leave, so he stuck around for a bit before he left for his second lifeguarding job. She wanted him to be there in case the workers were around, but they weren't in sight, so she said it was okay for him to go. The police followed this lead, and they reached out to the lawn and garden group. Although they didn't find any likely suspects among the employees, these interviews yielded the first big break in this case. The workers told police the day before Allie's murder, when they were mowing the lawn, they saw a man lurking around in the bushes outside the pool with a camera or binoculars. Wow, that's creepy and also very interesting. And they thought he appeared to be looking at the girls sunbathing. Then they said, on the day of Allie's murder, when they were on break sitting in their truck in the pool parking lot, they saw a white male driving an early 1980s Ford pickup truck circling the lot 3 or 4 times before driving away. This was their first big tip. So police were asking anyone who may have seen anything out of the ordinary to come forward, and that's when 3 teenage boys also said they saw something. They saw a man lurking in the bushes the day before the murder. Police then worked with all of their eyewitnesses to put together a sketch of their potential suspect. He was known to be a Caucasian male with a tan complexion, slender, maybe in his 30s or 40s, driving an early 1980s beige or tan Ford pickup truck. The sketch was released on June 22nd, and the tips started to pour in. Everyone wanted to help identify this man. But soon, there would be not 1, but 2 police sketches of the possible suspect. And that's because, remember Allie's friend? She came forward. The one that was supposed to meet her at the pool that day. She drove away, thinking that she saw Allie's boss. But now, she knew the man she saw was not Allie's boss. No one could account for who this man was or why he was there that day, so he rose to the top of the suspects list. The standard police procedure for developing a sketch is by using a kit of facial features, either on an overhead projector or a computer screen. But these kind of tools lack tiny nuances. And on top of that, Allie's friend was traumatized. And because of this, they were not able to put together a sketch that looked enough like the man she thought she saw. So the police decided to bring in a woman named Lee Hammond, who was an expert sketch artist. She had retired at the time from forensic sketching, but she volunteered to return to the force to help with this case. Lee met with Roger Kemp, and she said that his passion and determination to find his daughter's killer made her want to help even more. She said the more she got to know Roger, the more his personal strength and character began to come out, and he became the personal spokesperson for every father out there. Sure enough, Lee was able to get a much better sketch from Allie's friend. They spent 3 hours together building the image of this unknown man that she had seen. She knew how important it was for her eyewitness account to be a part of this case. Lee started by asking Allie's friend to close her eyes and remember that day, to imagine the sights, the sounds, and the smells of the Foxborough pool. When they finished the image, Allie's friend said that every other composite made him look mean, but to her, he just looked sad. The finished sketch showed a white man in his 30s, somewhere between 5'10" and 6 feet tall, with a heavy build. He had short brown hair and was wearing clothes that might have been overalls or a blue shirt and blue slacks. Immediately, Allie's friends and family jumped in action, doing everything they could to circulate these sketches, both of the sketches, which looked entirely different, by the way. I'm going to put both of them up on the screen if you're watching. The one from the lawn care workers and the teens had more of a slim facial structure, whereas the one created by Allie's friend had more of a rounder face. Allie's boyfriend gathered a group of Allie's friends, and they traveled around town and the nearby suburbs handing out these flyers with the 2 police sketches. Their plan was to distribute 10,000 flyers. Phil said they were going to go everywhere in the area where somebody could be from. And while searching, the friends took a pause to hold hands and say the Lord's Prayer in remembrance of Allie. Lindsay Courtney, one of Allie's friends, remembered that spring break trip to Florida when they'd all been talking about things they wish they had done differently, and how Allie said she had no regrets, that she would do it all again the exact same way. And at least they knew that Allie had lived the life she wanted, even if it was cut short. While Phil and Allie's friends worked to distribute flyers, Roger Kemp was working overtime to get Allie's murder and the manhunt for her killer in the media. He wanted to spread the word as far as he could. You never know who might see the sketches or hear Allie's story and know something. Roger said he had to keep moving. He had to think how he could catch this predator. He wasn't going to let him get away. Roger went on the news. He was talking to the media all the time. He even told the killer, "You will be caught." In another segment, he begged anyone who knew anything to come forward. He said, "Please call in those leads. You have a choice whether you can stay in bed, pull the covers over your head, or whether you get out and you try to make something." Many of the reporters that Roger met with remember him till this day. One said that Roger's face was the portrait of pain, but he just kept going. Amy Anderson, another reporter, said that she remembered thinking that Roger Kemp was an amazing father because he was so driven to find who did this to his daughter. He was such a warrior and a champion for Allie. And that is why I told you, a father like this should be protected at all costs. He's the definition of what a father should be. Allie loved him so much, and it was evident how much he loved her. He was never going to give up. Roger also offered a reward, hoping that monetary compensation might motivate someone to come forward with information. He raised $24,000, and then an additional $1,000 was contributed by the TIPS hotline. And then, amazingly, Kansas City provided $25,000 in matching funds from the city's contingency fund, bringing the total reward for any tips that led to an arrest to $50,000. Then, only 6 days after Allie's murder, Roger Kemp went on the show America's Most Wanted. The family was hopeful that this show might lead to a major break in the case, because just a couple years before, back in 1993, the show had broadcasted just a 40-second segment about another murder of a young woman in Leawood, a Pittsburgh State University student named Stephanie Schmidt. And 10 hours later, the murderer, Donald Ray Gideon, came forward, saying that he had seen the clip and wanted to turn himself in. If the show had worked to solve another murder, why not Allie's? The episode aired on August 3rd at 8 p.m. 10 to 12 million people watched that show each week. After the airing, the tips came flooding in. The show director said the calls that came in after this specific episode were the highest number of calls ever to result from a single episode. And the police started to sift through all the tips. And Roger kept going. Like I said, he was never going to stop until the killer was found. Allie's friend Jennifer said that Roger's energy was so inspiring and so uplifting to her and many of Allie's friends, and that's what kept them going and kept them strong. I'm sure it was incredibly hard for Allie's parents. I'm sure it would be for any parent. They had the most wonderful daughter who was everything they could have ever imagined, and they were just minding their own business in life when something like this happens. Police were also inspired by Roger's efforts and matched his determination. They tracked down every lead they could think of. The police major, Craig Hill, said that the bottom line was they were going to turn over every single rock. And under one of those rocks, the suspect would be hiding. They were hopeful that it wouldn't take too much more time. Officers were working overtime at this point, getting special approval to work weekends or stay in the office until midnight or even till 2 a.m. Detectives sent an alert to the National Crime Information Center and the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. Leawood Detective Ron Holsey was put in charge of tracking the truck that had been seen at the pool, and he used computer records to search for every 1980 and 1981 Ford pickup registered in Kansas and Missouri. He said that there were more than 300 in the metropolitan area alone. He also drove his wife crazy looking for tan pickup trucks wherever they went. He would see one and he would have to drive around the block to get the license plate number. Police also looked into the S offenders that were in the area, but none of them seemed like they matched the description of the man at the pool. Or they could have been Allie's killer since they either had alibis or their DNA was not a match. And of course, the biggest chunk of investigators' time was spent running down every lead and tip that came in. When the second sketch came out, it generated over 100 tips in just one day. When America's Most Wanted generated even more, they followed up on each of them, checking to see if any of them led to a viable suspect. They checked up on many sightings of trucks, many sightings of people that supposedly looked like the sketch, but none of them were promising. But Roger Kemp had done his job well, and they had new tips every day to investigate and clear. People were calling and saying, "Oh, my neighbor looks like that sketch," or "My coworker looks like him." There were even people willing to turn over their relatives' clothing for DNA testing, saying that the sketch looked like them. That's progress. But still, there were no matches. And Roger was convinced if they didn't find this guy, he was going to kill someone else. So he didn't want this case to go cold. As a matter of fact, family members of victims aren't usually allowed to know everything that the police do. You've heard and seen this before. But in this case, since Roger was working so hard on his daughter's case, Major Hill pulled him aside and said, "Listen, you're going to be part of this investigation team. We're going to let you be privy to everything that we know." And finally, a tip came in that seemed like it might hold water. Someone called in and said they were suspicious of a guy named James Strader. The tipster said that James looked exactly like the sketch, and he might have a violent criminal record. And let me tell you, they weren't lying. The detectives really thought the sketch looked exactly like James. That, or it could be his twin, or better yet, the same person, the killer. Other than the eyebrows, I can see it for the most part, but the sketch's brows look more furrowed. However, we know that shapes of eyebrows change when a person makes a certain expression, and Allie's friend did say that the man looked sad to her. Plus, James Strader drove an old pickup truck that resembled the one seen at the pool. He worked at a small auto repair shop in Olathe, Kansas, which is about a 20-minute drive from Leawood. Detectives immediately went to James's house, and he cooperated, answering all their questions. He denied having anything to do with Allie's murder. He said he was at work all day that day and told police they could just call his boss and verify. Police contacted James's boss, and he did back up his alibi, saying the two of them were working at the time of Allie's murder, and they were there all day long. He said there was no way James could have left without him knowing. Disappointed by yet another dead end, police returned to the drawing board and the ever-growing pile of tips. And in the end, they decided not to collect James's DNA because it was expensive to do DNA testing, and his alibi was strong. But would someone lie for a killer? It's not unheard of. But they weren't going to take a chance. They applied for a warrant to search his truck, and inside, they found a pair of women's underwear and some blood on one of the seats. And for investigators, this seemed like a match that they were looking for. They knew that Allie's underwear were missing from the scene, and it had been a bloody crime scene, so no doubt some of that blood could have been transferred to the killer's vehicle. But what really made them think that they had found the killer was what was written in a journal found inside that truck. Inside the journal, he wrote that he was the devil's child, and that maybe he wouldn't get caught for what he had done. If he did, he was going to take his life. So they definitely confronted him about the underwear, about what he said in the book. And at first he says, "Oh, they're my cousin's underwear." What? Yeah, he said that she left them in there. But then he changed his story and said he didn't know how they got there or whose they were. And he became angry about them going through his journal, that it was personal and only written because he was depressed, and it had nothing to do with the murder. Well, for one thing, the underwear were not Allie's, and what appeared to be blood on the seat didn't react chemically to a preliminary test. And of course, there was James's alibi. So they really didn't have anything concrete to hold him on. It was disappointing because they really thought that he was the killer. Now, in July of 2002, the search went national. People began to think that maybe the killer wasn't from the area at all, or that if he was, he had fled to another state. So new flyers were made and news articles created with the headline, "Do you know who killed me?" featuring a picture of Allie, as well as a write-up about who she was and how she was killed. Leawood police sent the sketches and the case information to other police departments around the country. They wanted to see if it was possible that this was a serial case. Did any other departments have cases that resembled this one? They were desperate to know if they could put any pieces together. But while other departments provided leads to the investigation, none of them led to capturing Allie's killer. Roger kept at it too. He said he was struggling, that sometimes he had to fight just to get out of bed, but he had to keep going for Allie. He wouldn't let himself stop until the murderer was found. He kept in frequent contact with the local police. He said, "We're always in touch at least once a week, and then sometimes many, many times." There were many days where every single day of the week, they would have at least one or two leads that would rise to the top of the pile. And Roger knew what happened to solve rates when cases went cold, and he refused to let that happen to Allie's case. But then in February of 2003, 8 months after Allie's murder, a familiar name resurfaced: James Strader. One of the investigators was actually watching the news when James's mugshot was put on the screen in relation to being wanted for a string of brutal, forceful sexual encounters and kidnappings of young women. I can't say the R word on this platform, but I think you know what I mean. The Kansas City Star published the full details of James's series of crimes. He began in Gardner, Kansas. There, he forced himself on a 22-year-old ex-girlfriend of his at knife point and then kidnapped her, driving her to Missouri. He drove to an abandoned mobile home and was trying to break in when a 14-year-old girl walked by. He threw her in his vehicle and took both women to another trailer where he forced himself on both of them. It's disgusting. James then threatened the younger girl, saying that he knew where she lived and he would kill her if she told anyone what happened. Then he let her go. James drove his ex-girlfriend back to Kansas City, but forced her into relations with him once again before finally letting her go as well. Then he actually did this to a third woman in Hutchinson at knife point after knocking on her door claiming that he had car trouble. This woman actually escaped from James Strader. With all these women being attacked in this manner and knowing that someone had done something similar, but even worse to Allie, James was back on the investigator's radar. He fit the profile, and he looked like the sketch. But when the media found out that a suspect in Allie's murder was now wanted for 3 sexual altercations and kidnappings in Kansas and Missouri, with one of the victims as young as 14, a media frenzy began. The media definitely latched on to the fact that the police never took James Strader's DNA. Plus, like I mentioned before, he had a Ford pickup truck, so everyone was convinced it had to be him. He had to be the killer. However, remember that in 2 of the 3 cases, James let the girls go, and he didn't brutally beat any of the women. Allie, however, was murdered so violently. That seems like a pretty different MO to me, and it did to detectives as well. But clearly, this guy is a very bad person. So many people thought that someone capable of this violent crime spree would also be capable of killing Allie. Maybe it was that she put up more of a fight and angered him. After all, she was very athletic, and everyone thought there were just too many coincidences for it not to be James. So investigators looked more deeply into his background, and things only looked worse. In 1996, in a fit of road rage, he hit a man in the face with a wrench. So he was capable of violence. In that case, he was granted what's known as a diversion, which means that he was ordered to pay restitution and pursue court-ordered therapy, but he wasn't put in jail. However, when he failed to do what he was ordered, he was put on probation. And while on probation in 1998, he was charged with forceful intercourse, burglary, and aggravated battery after he forced his way into the apartment of the 21-year-old mother of his child and attacked and violated her. James's attorney, however, was able to get this forceful intercourse taken off the charges because he showed that the woman had made similar allegations against a police officer that she had dated. But it looks like she was right though, doesn't it? This is why we should believe women. Just because it's happened to them more than once doesn't mean they're lying, because let's face it, there are more than just one or two men willing to force a woman into having their way with them. This time, James was sent to prison on burglary and aggravated battery charges. He remained incarcerated from July 1998 to August 1st, 2001, so just a year before Allie's murder. The problem is, no one knew where James was now, so the manhunt was on. 1 week passed, then 2, and finally 3 weeks had gone by, and there were no leads on James's whereabouts. But right when they think he slipped through their fingertips, they get a lucky break. There was news that he'd moved to Utah. So investigators on Allie's case make sure to forward all of the case information, as well as the warrant for his arrest, to the Utah authorities. And finally, Utah police run into James when he decides to skip out on paying for gas. The gas station attendant called 911, and the police pulled James over just up the road. At which point, he was arrested after they ran his license and saw that he had an arrest warrant. There's actually some dash cam footage of this that I'm going to be playing on the screen. So Leawood detectives were notified, and they thought the search for Allie Kemp's killer might, at last, be over. The Leawood Police Department flew Detective Langer out to interview James in Utah before he was even brought back to Kansas. And when he was first arrested by police in Utah, it appeared he might even be willing to cooperate with law enforcement. He told police when they pulled him over, "You might as well just cuff me now because I'm wanted." And then, in a Utah courtroom, he didn't speak to a lawyer and he accepted his extradition back to Kansas. But when Kansas police came calling to question him about Allie's murder, his cooperation ended. He continued to adamantly deny he had any involvement in her killing, even though he did admit that he looked like the guy in the composite sketch. But ultimately, he asked for a lawyer right away, and he wouldn't speak. But police actually didn't need James to answer any of their questions. They just needed his DNA, and luckily, because of his new string of crimes and his recent arrest, his DNA had been collected, and they felt sure that his DNA would be a match for the DNA from the crime scene. And finally, they received the results. It wasn't James Schrader's DNA. It didn't match. He couldn't have been Allie's killer. And this was another huge letdown. Everyone had been so sure it was him. While the amount of tips coming in was a good thing, it also meant that this buildup, followed by a disappointment like this, was a common occurrence for the Kemp family. They were on a roller coaster of emotions for the entire investigation, and this letdown with James wasn't the end they hoped for, just another disappointment. The 1-year anniversary of Allie's death was approaching very fast, and Roger Kemp still refused to give up. He would not rest until he tried everything he could to track down his daughter's killer. Roger then had a new idea of how he could get the word out and not let the case run cold. He took out a half-page ad in USA Today, advertising a rebroadcasting of Allie's episode of America's Most Wanted. Then Roger organized a rally for Allie, a benefit at the Longhorn Steakhouse in Leawood, where members of the Royals, the Kansas City baseball team, came out and signed autographs to raise money for the search for Allie's killer. The Royals' director of community relations said that it was important that her family knew that they weren't alone in their pain, that they were all grieving with them. On the 1-year anniversary of Allie's death, her friends came together to remember her, holding a candlelight vigil and planning a memorial garden alongside Tomahawk Park with dozens of petunias and plans for a memorial bench as well. This is when Roger came up with an even more innovative idea, one last-ditch effort to drum up tips: billboards. While driving, Roger realized how many people drive past billboards every day. Thousands and thousands, including people that are not from the area and may even be out of state. It was the perfect way to reach people that a flyer and a media campaign might have missed. I don't know if you remember or have been here long enough to have seen my close to 3-hour deep dive into the Rogers family murders, but they also use this idea of putting up a billboard. Roger called the police to run this idea by them, and they said they had never heard of someone using a billboard to find a killer before, but they didn't think it could hurt. Billboards were expensive, though. In the Kansas City area, a 3-billboard package normally costs about $10,000 to $12,000 a month, plus $4,500 to even make the signs. But Roger didn't care. He would spare no expense to find his daughter's killer. However, in the end, he didn't have to break the bank. because a local advertising company heard what he wanted to do, and they actually gave him the space for these billboards free of charge. Just another example of how the Leawood community rallied behind Roger. Within weeks, there were billboards along US 71, Interstate 70, and Interstate 35 featuring the composite sketch, plus an image of the Ford pickup beneath giant red letters reading, "Do you know him?" Then under that, it said wanted for questioning for murder, and on the bottom it read $50,000 reward and a number to call. They were impossible to miss. If you lived in this area, you would drive by at least one of them sooner or later. Roger sat back and waited, praying that his new approach would work. And work it did. The police said they were shocked at how effective this new strategy was. Tips started to pour in again like they had in the beginning of the case. This was also around the time in May 2003 when the pool where Allie had been killed was finally reopened to local residents. Almost 1 year had passed since it had been designated as a crime scene from June 18th until they reopened it. And when they did, they implemented new security measures, especially considering the killer was still out there. There were electronic key cards needed to enter, and pool employees were now wearing panic alarms that signal a monitoring company to call 911 in case of an emergency. They also had 2 people on duty at a time. And I wondered about the access from the beginning. This was supposedly a private pool for Foxborough and Hunter Ridge residents only, but it did appear that there were not any measures to prevent anyone from just walking right in. I don't know. I tried looking at the gates. I tried zooming in the photos, but it really did seem like you could just walk inside. But now I want to go back to all the tips. There was one lead that seemed promising, a lookalike of a second sketch, and his name was Ted Hoover. A caller said that Ted not only looked like the sketch, but he also owned a pool servicing company and a Ford pickup truck. So police ran his name, but they found no address and information for a Ted Hoover in the area. So they waited, hoping that more information might come in. And sure enough, another caller reached out saying that they thought the sketch also resembled Ted Hoover. But this caller provided an address for Ted in Kansas City. Sergeant Henson jumped on this immediately. He drove to Ted's house to interview him. Ted answered the door, and at first he answered Henson's questions, saying that he knew of the Foxborough pool and that he did own a pool service company. However, when Henson's question shifted towards Allie, that's when Ted seemed to clam up. He said he had nothing to do with her murder. He couldn't remember where he was the day she was killed, but he knew he had never been to that pool before, and he refused to provide a DNA sample. He said he wanted to consult with his lawyer first. So immediately, Sergeant Henson was on high alert. He knew that any time someone refused to give a DNA sample, it made them look suspicious. He wondered, could this be their man? Could the billboards really have led police straight to Allie's killer? Based on what they had so far, though, the police couldn't force Ted to provide DNA. But he said that he'd check back with them after consulting with his attorney. But you know what? That never happened. Eventually, they hoped they would find a way to get this man's DNA. That's all they really needed. So a few days later, an investigator called Ted's lawyer to set up an appointment to get his DNA. But his lawyer said that that was gonna be a problem because Ted had skipped town. The lawyer said he wasn't exactly sure where his client had gone, but he thought it might have been to Florida. Police were now even more suspicious of this Ted Hoover. He matched the sketch, he owned a Ford pickup truck, he worked in pool services, and he didn't seem to have an alibi for the day of Allie's murder. And also he refused to provide DNA. And now why would you run? Innocent people don't usually flee. So police knew they had to track Ted down. And once again, the billboards came to the rescue. Another caller contacted the police with information about Ted Hoover. This caller said they thought he might have moved to Connecticut with his girlfriend. Finally, in November of 2004, a full year and a half after Allie's murder, police located the girlfriend's address in Bandham, Connecticut. Then they contacted postal workers who delivered to that house. And one postal worker said there wasn't anyone named Ted Hoover receiving mail at that location, but there was a man living there, and he was receiving mail under the name Benjamin Appleby. Police immediately looked up records for a Benjamin Appleby, and when law enforcement searched his name, they found a man who looked suspiciously like Ted Hoover. Interesting. Furthermore, this Appleby guy did have a criminal record, and he'd even served time in prison. So police wanted to go even further into Benjamin Appleby's background, trying to learn as much as they could about him before they made their move. They found out as a child Ben's parents divorced, and he moved back and forth between them. His father, Gary Appleby, knew from the time his son was just a kid that there was no doubt a lot of problems with him. Young Ben started stealing beer out of the fridge at 10 or 11 years old, according to his parents. And then in high school, his behavior only escalated. He started getting drunk every weekend. And in 1992, the summer of his junior year, Ben robbed a donut shop and a convenience store. And in one robbery, he pointed a gun at the clerk and pulled the trigger. The gun didn't go off. And later, Ben told a therapist that it wasn't even loaded. But nevertheless, that would have been a horrifying experience for the clerk that didn't know that. Ben explained his actions, saying that he hated his life at home and he was feeling lousy, and it all just worked him up to the point that he committed armed robbery. And then he spiraled even further during his senior year. He stopped doing his work, he partied constantly, and he said that he had a bad reputation and he lived up to it. Finally, he ended up dropping out. The robbery was only the beginning for Benjamin Appleby. 6 months later, his crimes took a more sinister and sexual nature when he was arrested for doing inappropriate things to himself in public in front of 2 women in a parking lot. I'm sure you know what I mean. In his court-appointed therapy, Ben's therapist observed that he failed to realize the severity of his sexual misconduct and that he was at a high risk to reoffend. He could pose a sexual, verbal, or physical harm to himself or others. This man didn't see the issue with what he was doing. He didn't think it was wrong, and that's a big problem. If someone doesn't think what they're doing is wrong, then what will stop them from continuing? The therapist's report described Ben as a young man who had a history of inappropriate alcohol use, anger problems, frequent legal entanglements, and he appeared to be emotionally immature. However, the therapist also noted he was intelligent and appeared to be fairly motivated for treatment and to make positive changes in his life and his behavior. However, this would not turn out to be the case, because just 8 months after the first indecent exposure incident, the state of Connecticut issued an arrest warrant for a similar incident involving another man, a Ted Hoover. It's obvious they're one and the same. I hope that wasn't too confusing with you. He obviously is going by a new name and committing the same crimes. So Kansas police immediately called Connecticut law enforcement. Since Ben was now in Connecticut, they needed to work with local authorities to bring him in for questioning and hopefully get his DNA. Connecticut police found 2 warrants for Ben for indecent exposure that were a few years old, but they told the Kansas police that they could arrest him on these outstanding charges. And while he was at the station, Kansas police could attempt to come in and question him about his potential involvement in Allie's murder. And this sounded like a good plan. Connecticut police also obtained a residential search warrant for the property where Ben had been living with his girlfriend and a warrant for his DNA. Now, all they had to do was make their move. On November 8, 2004, Connecticut detective Daniel Juris arrested Benjamin at the house he was residing at. Other officers remained there to search the home per their warrant, while the detective took Ben in for questioning. While they were driving to the station, Ben told the detective that he had been in some trouble in his past, so he'd taken on the name of his deceased childhood friend, Teddy Hoover. Wow. So he is a dead man walking. That's eerie, and it's also very deceptive. As soon as Ben arrived at the station, the authorities took that DNA sample per their warrant. Ben did attempt to refuse the DNA swab, but the authorities informed him he would be compelled to provide the DNA whether he wanted to or not because of the warrant, so he had to comply. By now, investigators had interviewed over 1,300 potential witnesses, suspects, and collected 900 DNA samples for comparison, and they were hoping that this would be their last one. This news clip that I found shows such a creepy picture of Ben. He just looks evil to me, and maybe that's because he is. Do you think that he resembled the sketch? I did not think he was as much of a match as James Strader, but I do see some similarities. While police waited for the results of the DNA test, Kansas police prepared to question Ben, who was not aware that the Leawood police officers were there at the Connecticut station. They had that element of surprise on their side, and they wanted to seize that opportunity. They wanted to ensure the conditions were optimal to get a confession if this was their guy, because they knew they probably wouldn't get another chance like this. So what they did was they prepared a secondary interview room with some props. And yes, I said props because that's what they did. They created a fake bulletin board on the wall. That's clever. And on the board, they had pictures like an aerial shot of the pool area, an image of Allie one of Ben himself, Allie's obituary crime scene photos, an investigation timeline, and all kinds of key pieces of evidence. And then on the desk where they were going to sit Ben down were 2 really thick 3-ring binders with Benjamin Appleby's name on the spine. They wanted to give him this impression that those binders were full of nothing but a bunch of incriminating evidence on him, and it is brilliant. When they arrived at the station, Ben was read his Miranda rights, and then he was told that there were 2 people who wanted to speak to him regarding an unrelated matter, as in not related to the indecent exposure warrants. First, the police took him into a regular interview room, not the one with the props in it, and he was introduced to the Leawood detectives. And as soon as Ben realized that this unrelated matter was the murder of Allie Kemp, he wasn't going to talk. He continued to deny his involvement, saying he was not at that pool, he never had been there, and he had nothing to do with her murder. So that's when they said, okay, fine, no problem. They started to lead him back out into the hallway. But instead of bringing him back to speak with the Connecticut cops, they moved him right into that staged interview room. This is my favorite part. Can you tell? As soon as his eyes locked with all the props, everything on the wall, he was just taking it all in. He was really focused on the picture of him in that middle of that link board, linking all the evidence to him in Allie's case. Police then lied. They told him, they're allowed to lie, by the way, I think you know that by now, but they told him that they found Ted Hoover's name on a log of people who were present at the pool that day. Now, Ben wouldn't stop looking at that board with his picture on it, right next to Allie's. And finally he said, I lied to you. I was at the pool. I just remembered. That was it. Police knew that they had him. They just had to keep pushing. They needed to get a full confession because he could be about to give a reason why he was there, but still say he wasn't involved. So they asked him why he had been there that day. And Ben explained that he went there because he was hoping to obtain the pool's business as a new client for his pool maintenance company. Sounds reasonable, sounds like it could actually be true. Now, I have portions of this interview and I'm going to play some of them for you. Because then he went on to say that when he was there, he did see Allie as well. He said he saw her from afar and he thought she was cute and he wanted to talk to her.
Can you go ahead and tell us what you remember and what happened that day?
I went in there with the intentions of looking at the pool to get the business.
She was in the pump
She
room.
was in the
is that
pump
correct?
room doing something with the pump.
And you wanted to have sex with her, right?
I wanted to hit on her, she was an attractive young lady.
So that's what he did, because he said she was good looking. And since he was actually a pool guy, he easily entered the pool area without seeming suspicious. He was carrying that bucket with him, making it look like perhaps he had been called there to test the pool water. He looked official with his pool company attire on, and Allie wouldn't have suspected anything. When he got there, she was entering the pump room to take care of her attendant duties, and as she began working on the pumps, the double doors were propped open by 2 trash cans on either side so anyone could freely enter that room, and that's exactly what Ben did. Then he began talking to Allie. He said that he hit on her, that it was small talk, and he didn't exactly remember what he said, but that Allie wasn't interested in what he had to say, and of course, that did not go over well with him. Allie couldn't have known that he was a violent predator. He was blocking the doorway, so Allie couldn't get out. And that is when Allie became concerned, and she attempted to go around him to escape. But that's when he grabbed her, calling this hitting on her, by the way. Here, I'm just going to let him explain this part.
Allie was in the pump room. No, I just hit on her, man. She was good looking. Small talk, I don't remember exactly what I said. She didn't, wasn't interested in anything I had to say. And I was blocking the doorway. I tried to hit on her. I touched her. Not hard, nothing. Either on the shoulder or the hip or something.
Okay, so he touched her. He grabbed her shoulder or her hip or her neck. And I think that would scare any woman all alone and trapped in a room that she couldn't get out of with a complete stranger. Allie pushed him back, and she actually punched him. And I have to say, way to go, Allie. She was brave. She stood up to this man, this big, strong man that stood in the way of her freedom to get out of there. But Ben wasn't going to let her go. He said that he lost it. Actually, I'll just let you hear him tell you.
She pushed me back, and she punched me. I was blocking the doorway, where she rejected me. She pushed me back. I just lost it. I hit her back. I hit her in the face, I think. I don't know how many times I hit her. Took her clothes off with the intention of trying to have sex with her.
And what happened?
I strangled her, I guess. You said she was strangled. I know I strangled her. I don't know what I strangled her with. And I don't know why I did it. I don't know why I did it. I killed her. And I laid it on. I just laid it on her. I didn't want anybody to find her like that. But I didn't think she was dead.
He said that he hit her again and again, and he kept hitting her. Ben is strong. He's big. He'd been a wrestler in high school. He'd been in prison. He easily overpowered Allie. He said he didn't know how many times he had hit her, but I think it's clear from the autopsy it was a brutal attack. He said that after she was unconscious, he took off her clothing to attempt to have his way with her. And even more disturbingly, police finally learn the reason that his blood had been found on the antibiotic ointment tube. Because he went to that first aid kit to find something he could use as a lubricant. I am not kidding. He grabbed for the antibiotic ointment and he used it to try to, how do I say this? Make his limp noodle stand at attention, but it wasn't working. This is a common problem that we see in these kind of predators, that they have issues in that department, and it's one of the reasons they take out their frustration on women like this. Finally, he said, I don't know why the F I did it, but I killed her. And he was saying this through tears and sobbing. I don't know if it was real or fake, but he admitted that he strangled her. But he said, I guess I strangled her, because he explained that he heard that she had been strangled. So he must have strangled her, but he doesn't know what he strangled her with. We know that it must have been something like a rope, a string, something he could tie around her neck while putting pressure on her shoulders and pulling backward while she's lying face down on the floor. Ben then explained that before leaving, he laid the blue tarp over her body. He said, I just laid it on her. I laid it on her. I didn't want anyone to find her like that. I didn't think she was dead. That he didn't mean to kill her. This man knew exactly what he was doing. That's clear. He saw what he had done to this poor woman, and he couldn't even bear to look at it. So he covered her with a tarp to conceal her not only from others, because of the shame that killers actually feel when they realize what they've done. Not all killers, but many of them don't want to look at their victims. This entire confession actually made me sick to my stomach. I had to pause it many times because I didn't want to look at his face. I think many women can relate to feeling that prickle of fear when we feel cornered or trapped by a man, maybe at a bar, a party, even walking the street. Sometimes it's a friend that rescues us, a kind stranger, and sometimes we have to save ourselves from this situation. It's not uncommon for men to become rude, bitter, or even aggressive when their advances are rejected. But to become murderous, to explode into something so terrifying at this level of violence, that's not something we expect, especially from a total stranger. It's clear from what Ben said in his confession and from the injuries that Allie sustained that despite the utter shock and terror of the moment, Allie fought her absolute hardest to escape. But unfortunately, Ben was enraged at her rejection. He felt entitled to her attention, entitled to her affection and her body. When she said no, he murdered her, slowly and brutally. Then, after all of that horrific violence, Ben left the pool carrying his bucket and waving nonchalantly at Allie's friend as he did. And he couldn't even keep himself away from the scene for very long after what he had done. He returned later that same day to watch the police investigation and the crime scene. He stood among the friends and family of Allie Kemp as they put up a memorial in her honor outside the pool. He watched the police tape off the scene, and he knew that he had done that. What kind of person is capable of that? Can you imagine standing right next to him in that crowd and not even knowing it? The reason they knew he did this was because he actually got in a car accident nearby. Someone hit his truck. Yet no one made the connection at that time that that truck matched the description of the one in the parking lot. The police had even gotten his name. He gave it as 10 Hoover, but they also got his phone number. And all that time went by, and they didn't know. Police were shocked and horrified by Ben's confession, but they also felt vindicated. They were glad that they finally had their killer. He was caught. I touched on this, but by the conclusion of this case, more than 1,300 witnesses and potential suspects were questioned locally and out in Las Vegas, South Carolina, Texas, Atlanta, Colorado, Washington, D.C., Utah, and Connecticut. DNA samples of over 900 people were compared to the ones from the crime scene. The 4 primary investigators on this case, Sergeant Scott Hansen, the detectives Joe Langer, John Dickey, and Ron Hulsey, they never gave up. But despite all of their work, they were quick to attribute a large part of the success of this investigation to Roger Kemp. Langer said he knows it might even sound corny, but Roger became a friend, and they saw a friend who was hurting. They said that Roger was such a devoted father and that they may never have solved this case without him. He never gave up. But despite this brief moment of triumph, police and Roger knew their work was far from over. They wouldn't be able to relax until they got a conviction. They said a lot of our work is just the beginning, and we owe it to the family to get a conviction. And Roger added that while there's relief in finding Allie's killer, it doesn't mean it's an end to their grief. People talk about closure, but he didn't see closure. He was still breathing, and Allie wasn't. And he had a problem with that. And Roger let it be known that Ben might have started this fight with Allie, but he was going to finish it. And I liked that. Before Ben left that night to be transferred to a Kansas jail, he told detectives that he planned to just take a plea deal, that he didn't want Allie's family to have to go through a trial because they had been through enough. But you can't trust anything a monster like this says, because within a day of the interrogation, Ben's DNA was matched to the DNA from the crime scene. He was Allie's killer, there's no doubt about it. But now, he wasn't interested in playing nice. I don't think he ever intended to simply give a plea deal. No. But he pled not guilty. He had all kinds of excuses as to why he allegedly was forced to confess, claiming it was a false confession, that the investigators threatened to hurt him and his family if he didn't confess. Really? They've got your DNA. What the hell? But he kept going. And initially he was charged with first-degree murder, which is punishable in Kansas by a life sentence, with 25 or 50 years of minimum served before the offender has a chance of parole. However, 2 hours before his first court appearance, his charges were upgraded to first-degree capital murder. This meant that he could now face the death penalty. The charges had been upgraded because Ben's actions demonstrated premeditation, and the murder was committed during an attempted commission of a sex crime, and because of the brutality of the crime. But now the prosecution would have to decide if they wanted to go for the death penalty or what they call a hard 50, which is a life sentence with 50 years minimum before an offender has a chance at parole. The prosecution had to weigh many factors in making this decision. For one thing, 64% of death penalty convictions are reversed on appeals nationwide. Plus, only one person had been successfully convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death since Kansas had reinstated capital punishment in 1994. And that was a guy named John Robinson Sr. who killed 2 women and concealed their bodies in barrels. There were also 8 aggravating factors to qualify a murder for the death penalty. It has to be first-degree murder, multiple victims, financial gain, a contract killing, killing of an incarcerated prisoner, resisting a lawful arrest, or the only one that applied in Allie's case, which was the murder was committed in an especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel manner. And unfortunately, the prosecution in Allie's murder felt that they fell a little short of the standard for especially heinous, because usually it had to involve either torture or mutilation. So in considering all these factors, they chose not to seek the death penalty. Instead, they were going to try to incarcerate him for the rest of his natural life. Well, this didn't go over very well with Roger, who thought his daughter's slaying was certainly atrocious enough to warrant the death penalty. And I have to agree, but of course we know this is the law, these are statutes, it's not about how we feel. but it's about the definition of the crime. Roger said he felt like the legal system gave way too much protection to murderers, and he also felt that he had really let Allie down. No matter your opinion on the death penalty, I can certainly empathize with Roger's anger and frustration. Allie was beaten again and again, and then slowly strangled, and the state was telling him that her death wasn't heinous or cruel enough? I can't imagine how it must have felt to hear that. When Ben appeared in court for his first hearing, he was wearing a tearaway self-harm prevention vest, and he used a copy of his charges to shield his face from the media. The trial was set for November of 2005, and when it came time for that trial, his attorney began by stating that this wasn't a case of whodunit. They weren't asking to let him go home after this, but they did want the right justice. The case would focus on pushing for the jury to find Ben guilty of a lesser crime than capital murder, thus reducing the time he spent in prison. In order to get Ben this lesser sentence, the defense, who was a woman, by the way, just wanted to point that out because sometimes that's a strategic move when a man is charged with killing a woman, to show, look, a woman is willing to represent him. But she focused on Ben's mental state at the time of the crime. She also wanted to focus on Allie's condition when paramedics arrived at the scene and the police's alleged coercion of Ben's confession. She made the argument that he was under the influence of extreme mental and emotional disturbance at the time of the murder, and thus his capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law was substantially impaired. I personally think this is a huge stretch. I get what she's trying to convey, that Ben snapped and wasn't in control of his actions for a brief period while he committed the murder, but come on. Who wouldn't feel mentally and emotionally disturbed while they're killing someone? She also implied that Allie might not have been dead when Ben left her, emphasizing the fact that firefighters had performed life-saving measures on Allie when they arrived, and that rigor mortis hadn't set in. This also really felt like a flimsy argument. Even if Allie wasn't dead when he left her there, there's no contesting the fact that she died soon after, and it was a direct result of Ben's actions. Finally, his defense attorney tried to make the case that since Kansas City had colluded with the Connecticut police, they acted outside their jurisdiction, and that the confession they got wouldn't be allowed in. The judge, however, ruled that the confession was in fact admissible, and that was a win for the prosecution. And the prosecution focused their case on the extreme violence with which this murder was committed, the premeditation that was involved, and Ben's history of violence and sex crimes. They also countered the defense's claims that Allie had not been dead when paramedics found her. They said it was common for firefighters to perform life-saving measures just in case, even when a person appears to be dead. They noted that EKG machine hadn't even been able to find the necessary heart rhythm required to be used. They had to explain what premeditation was to the jury. While the defense claimed that Ben had not intended to kill Allie when he arrived at the pool that day, the prosecution explained he didn't have to have a plan that far in advance for this murder to be premeditated. They instructed the jury that by Kansas law, premeditation doesn't have to be present before a fight, a quarrel, or a struggle begins. There's no specific time period required for premeditation, but it does require more than an instantaneous intentional act of taking someone's life. Premeditation can occur at any time during a violent episode that ultimately causes someone's death. And I learned in law school that premeditation can happen in the blink of an eye. Plus, it was planned. His truck was seen there on other occasions, and you could have seen the pool maintenance schedule hanging on the wall outside the pump room. It's large, it's in plain sight, and it would have made sense to a person like him who worked on pools. It had times when certain tasks would need to be carried out by pool attendants, including Allie. We know she was alive at 2:50 when she texted her friend and called her boyfriend. And she was already attacked by 5 when Tyler came to relieve her from her shift. And according to the pool maintenance schedule that was on that wall, at 4 p.m., Allie would have gone to test the pool water. She would have gone into that pump room for chemicals. Ben was waiting for that specific moment when he could corner her. These details, coupled with the autopsy report that said it likely took Ben 15 minutes to strangle Allie, clearly established premeditation. 15 minutes was not instant. There were many moments in which he could have stopped what he was doing, but instead, he chose to keep going. In the end, the prosecution called 13 witnesses to testify on Allie's behalf, including her father, her boyfriend, and her brother. They also played the 5-minute-long emotional recording of Roger Kemp's 911 call. People on both sides of the courtroom were in tears. It was no surprise. On December 5, 2005, after only 2.5 hours of deliberation, the jury found Benjamin Appleby guilty of capital murder and attempted forced intercourse. When the jury announced their decision, Roger said, "It seems like that day had been 3 days long, and everyone swarmed to hug him and the rest of the Kemp family." Allie's boyfriend shook each one of the detectives' hands. Finally, they had done it. Ben was guilty. Now all that was left was the sentencing. And like a coward that he was, Ben did not attend the sentencing hearing on December 26th to face the Kemp family and their impact statements. The Johnson County District Attorney, Phil Morrison, said that jailers had trouble getting Ben out of his cell that morning. Why? Because Ben said he didn't want to hear all the lies and misrepresentations about his criminal past. Poor Ben. He doesn't want to face the truth. It wasn't lies. It's the truth about what this monster really did and who he really is. Morrison went on to say that cowards shrink responsibility, and that's what he was trying to do. Allie's mom, Kathy, who had stayed away for most of this trial and wasn't in the public as much as her husband, did make an appearance for the sentencing along with Roger. More than 50 others filled the courtroom, all wearing white and lavender ribbons for Allie. The prosecution reiterated their case from trial, and the defense brought 2 people forward to testify on Ben's behalf, his sister and a clinical psychologist. His sister, in an extremely quiet voice, told the courtroom that Benjamin would always be her big brother. And his psychologist said that he was suffering from intermittent explosive disorder. We've heard about this in other cases. It's characterized by an outpouring of rage, sometimes out of proportion to what might have happened. And they wanted to offer this as a potential mitigating factor. In the end, however, Ben's witnesses made 0 impact on the judge, who assigned him the maximum sentence of 50 years and 228 months for an attempted forced sexual conduct. This was an absolute victory for the Kemp family. It was the highest possible sentence he could have received other than death. But in the end, Allie's mother, Kathy, said, "It's never going to be over. I'm never going to get Allie back. I'm not going to be able to help her pick out a wedding dress. I'm not going to be a grandmother. It will go on until I die. She was the love of my life, and that truly does hurt my heart." I'm so sorry to this family. And it is truly sad that her only daughter was dead and was never coming back. Sentencing should have been the end of all of these horrible trials for this family who already suffered so much. After almost 5 years of fighting, they should have been able to start the new year attempting to find some peace and start to rebuild their lives. But even after the trial, Ben would not let his conviction rest. Like many other criminals of his kind, he appealed his sentence not once, not twice, but 5 separate times. 5. Yeah. You've got to have something really wrong with you if you confess, your DNA is at the scene, and you're still trying to get out of murdering someone. He appealed in November 2009, then again in October 2010, in February 2015, in August 2019, and most recently, just a few years ago, in April of 2021. And Roger fought Ben on every one of his appeals. He said, "I never, ever wanted to say his name. I never said it but once. And then I swore I would never say his name again, but I'm going to say it a lot now. Benjamin Appleby is a murderer. He deserves to be in jail for 50 years. Roger collected information on Ben's past behavior to show that not only did he harm Allie, but that he had a history of dangerous behavior, which would likely reoccur if he was released. Some of this evidence came from a book, Allie Was Here, from Jim Davis, in which Ben's years of violent sex crimes preceding Allie's murder were detailed. Roger Kemp shared an email, a P.O. box, and even a Facebook page for anyone who wanted to submit information to help bolster his case against Ben. Anyone that wanted to talk about his past, his violent tendency, their experience they had with him. Roger said that Ben is someone that goes against our society, that goes against our laws, that doesn't care about the law until he's caught. And then he wants every right under the book that he's so willing to take away from someone else. He silenced Allie's voice. She has no voice in this. She can't speak, so he was speaking for her. And shockingly, one of his appeals actually did go through. They overturned his attempted forced intercourse conviction, the one that added the 228 consecutive months. That was removed. The court ruled that it was kind of double dipping because he'd already been given 2 sentences for the same crime. His attempt was part of that 50-year sentence. But that wasn't good enough for Ben. He wanted to try for more freedom. In the following decade, he appealed on several other grounds, all of which were unsuccessful, thank goodness. He's still incarcerated in the Hutchinson State Prison, where he will not be eligible for parole till 2054. And although Ben's many appeals have been traumatizing for the Kemp family, who has had to be forced to wonder again and again whether Allie's killer might be set free, they have not allowed this to distract them from their mission after Allie's death. Allie's friends and family said they always knew Allie would make a difference in her life, although they didn't expect her to make a difference after death. They hoped she would be proud of the way her name, her story, and her family are changing the lives of tens of thousands of women. Roger Kemp worked to form the Allie Kemp Educational Foundation. It forms the acronym TAKE, T-A-K-E. So they called it Take Defense. TAKE provides educational scholarships to young women and hosts 2-hour-long self-defense classes. Their website states that women have the right to feel safe wherever they go, and their classes, offered around the country, often in campus universities, aim to make the goal a reality. They offer classes and tips on how to avoid a variety of dangerous situations, how to verbally and psychologically respond in case of an attack, and ultimately how to engage if you do enter into a physical attack. They teach women how to strike an attacker's eyes, nose, throat, and groin long enough to break away. Knowing these moves can help. If you've never practiced anything like this, you usually just freeze up. But when you know the moves, you can easily do them and possibly get away. Now, I know, because I've taken this class, it can help. It can give you a lot of great advice and a lot of great moves to make. But sometimes I think, would this have helped Allie? Would this have changed anything for someone in her situation? And I want to ask you, what would you have done? We always want to take away a lesson or learn something from these cases so that maybe we can protect ourselves or others. And I had to think hard. So give me your thoughts in the comments. I don't know if Allie could have done anything to prevent this monster from harming her unless maybe she was armed with a gun. And that wouldn't have seemed very reasonable or even been allowed wearing a bathing suit or shorts or just attending a local pool. Thinking that this 19-year-old would have had to carry a firearm just to be safe. I think the best way would have been to avoid this altogether, to proactively protect women by never having them work alone. Killers are less likely to initiate attack on a woman if they're with someone else. They don't want to deal with someone fighting them or running to get help. So they purposely target unsuspecting females that are by themselves and more vulnerable. Ben saw Allie all alone. He waited for his chance to attack her. Had there been just one other person at the pool that day, either working or just swimming, this could have been different. Roger was even honored by the President, Obama at the time, and awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal. It's the second highest civilian award given by the president for Roger's work with the Take Foundation. Tragically, Roger passed away unexpectedly recently on March 1st of 2022. He left behind his wife of 43 years, Kathy Kemp, his 2 sons, Tyler and Drew, and a brand new granddaughter who was only 16 months old at the time. And she was named Alexandra after Allie. He was remembered in a memorial service on Friday, March 11th at the United Methodist Church of the Resurrection. His family said, quote, "We know our darling Allie was waiting on March 1st when the gates of paradise opened for her father. Though Allie couldn't come back to her dad, eventually he went to her, knowing he had done everything he could do for his daughter on this earth before joining her in heaven," end quote. That really does make me tear up, that Daddy's princess was waiting for him. And now they're together in another realm. Thank you so much for being here for Allie's heartbreaking story. Please share it with someone you think would want to hear it. And I will see you in my next video. Bye.